When we discuss boss fights, we often come to the table with a certain expectation. Maybe when I say boss fight, you think of some cinematic battle where the story comes to a head, like in God of War. Maybe you think of a challenge of every skill you've learned in the story so far, like in Sekiro or most FromSoft games. Or maybe you're looking for the spectacle, you just want to see some massive foe crash to the ground like Azura's Wrath or Final Fantasy. Usually, in any one game, there's a fairly decent through line with that boss design, some element that appears time and time again, making every boss in that game feel like a part of the full experience. In Elden Ring, for example, gameplay is king, with only a few bosses dipping into spectacle or story, but never enough to overcome that emphasis on the gameplay loop. But sometimes, that through line doesn't exist, and bosses are so specifically built to fill their own niche that they begin to feel wholly unique. Death's Door is one such game. Boasting only 8 bosses, one of whom is optional, the bosses of Death's Door cover any niche you could think of. A cinematic climax to the story, a challenging moveset forcing you to find the crack in it, or moments of intense spectacle. And each does so completely differently. Death's Door is a fascinating, fun little game, and it only has any major fumbles in an optional epilogue, and so I definitely recommend it. After playing the game twice, once casually and once using only the umbrella weapon in order to get that achievement, I wanted to talk about this fascinating roster of bosses, and also make a boss analysis video that wasn't 2 hours long. So, without further ado, let's get our assignment and go reaping. From the framework of the story of Death's Door, the demonic forest spirit is a tale of 2 bosses. At the start of the game, you're told to go and fetch a soul. You travel forward, and you reach that soul. This is your entire mission. You kill this spirit, and the journey is done. Of course, the player knows this is a lie because they've been playing the game for maybe 15 minutes tops. The demonic forest spirit is the tutorial boss, built out of simple moves to test your fundamental understanding of Death's Door's mechanics, mobility, attacks, and how to dodge. Though there is a bit of inherent spectacle in fighting any monster larger than oneself, this fight is mechanics-driven first and foremost. As the spirit slams down its tendrils and slides around the arena, it challenges you to use your roll to dodge attacks that you didn't see coming, dart in and out of melee range, and focus on positioning to dodge while still being able to output offense. These are the fundamentals of combat for the entire rest of the game. Attacks that force you away hope to encourage you to utilize your ranged attack, which pushes players into trying to use a mix of melee and magic for both bosses and general gameplay. Now, there are no shortcuts against the demonic forest spirit. The only way forward here is learning to recognize, evade, and punish her attacks. Death's Door doesn't use health bars, and though that makes me sad because my Unga Bunga brain does love a good health bar, the substitute they use really helps add to the game's atmosphere. Enemies will become red and start to gain what looks like cracks across their body. As their attacks speed up throughout the fight, the same visual trick that tells you about the boss's worsening condition also works to justify that slow escalation of difficulty. And that mechanic is introduced expertly in this battle as the spirit becomes more and more mobile in the arena as the fight continues. Once the spirit goes down, you get the game's first cinematic, as the Grey Crow appears, knocks you out, and steals your prize. It works well as a story beat, but there's nothing notable about the spirit, so the game doesn't try to make it notable or more significant than it is. Your role here is to kill things and to take their souls, and so you really only care once something has gone wrong. It punctuates the tutorial and story well, getting the player curious as to why this soul was stolen. The spirit is definitely a B-grade boss, and introduces encounters in this game as mechanical battles, with a little spectacle sprinkled on top for good measure. It does introduce a story element, but the story element doesn't come into play with the boss fight itself, only with the context that the boss appears within. Then, the Guardian of the Door appears and throws all that nonsense about story that had started being introduced completely out the window. This is now a spectacle first, mechanic second fight with no immediate clear story relevance, or even in reflection, still no clear story relevance. The Guardian of the Door is an exceptionally cool looking big building thing with rockets and lasers. The moves are easier to dodge than the enraged forest spirit, but feel way bigger. The entire screen goes red and shakes with each laser. The scale of the building swinging at you is just massive. It feels bizarre that this thing landing on you is somehow equal in threat to the tendrils of the forest spirit. It is a tough boss to talk about because this Final Fantasy looking boy just kinda speaks for himself. He forces you to run around the arena respecting its massive size as he slowly lumbers around and continuously flies to reset himself at the top of the arena for a bullet hell-esque attack, which also stops him from ever staying somewhere that the camera starts to suffer. It's a great way to combine the game's locked camera with the boss's scale, and again, focuses on that spectacle first. The moveset is simple, but a lot more diverse than the Forest Spirit. Melee swings with a spin, the aforementioned laser beam mixing missiles with melee attacks flying up and crashing down. There is more complexity being thrown at you faster, and by having the Guardian continually reset to the top right of the arena, that camera, as I mentioned, always works really smoothly. But to talk about scale, this is the largest boss in the game just 2 fights in, and by a pretty significant margin too. It is a bit of a strange decision to make such a physically massive boss be, in terms of the game's overall story, the least significant boss in the game. You could remove this fight and the rest of the game would still work just as well, and it's the only boss that you can say that. But with the Spirit not having any story importance and the Guardian of the Door following, the game has started to set a trend of bosses that are mechanical and spectacle focused first and foremost. The story often takes a back seat, happening in the background. The Guardian Door is in this game solely because it is fun to fight, and the Forest Spirit only has a moment of story after the battle is done, and all of this has started to set up certain expectations from the player. Overall, I'd give the Guardian of the Door a B grade. It's an exciting spectacle fight that does appear far earlier in the game than you'd expect something like this to appear, but does its spectacle so well that it is still an exciting hurdle to overcome. But suddenly, the game decides that it has now changed the definition of what a boss fight is. Unlike the Forest Spirit and the Guardian of the Door, who were fun creature designs driven by their mechanics, the Witch of Urns is a character first and foremost. You have conversations with her throughout her area. Her powers are explicitly stated, and each move she uses feels like an expression of character, with the gameplay coming second. The witch loops through a small series of attacks, with each attack getting faster and faster as she gets lower on health. She floats around in this goofy dance-like pose, throwing urns from the area prior that all explode in unique and distinctive ways before she slams herself into an urn, creating a short bullet hell, and then hopping around for a while before she gets dizzy and falls over. It is such a beautifully bizarro fight that you can't help but smile as you kill the first of the 3 bosses you've been tasked with defeating. On top of that, the witch introduces a Zelda-like concept of using your abilities to strike a weakness during her attacks to stop them and get easy damage off. The Forest Spirit and Guardian had no shortcuts, no weakness that you could immediately exploit, but landing a fireball into the urn while she's trapped inside causes the urn to explode and send her flying out. It fits with the goofy nature of the fight and encourages using magic in a really fun way. Then, as if changing the fundamental drive, tone, and intent of the game's boss fights wasn't enough, the fight ends with the Gravedigger and the witch's nephew arriving to give the Witch of the Urns a proper funeral, which adds a surprisingly solemn tone to the goofy victory. Once I beat the Witch of Urns, Death's Door had me completely hooked. Easily earning a high A grade, the Witch lets its story and character justify the rest of the design of the boss fight, completely abandoning the design philosophy of the first 2 and creating an entertaining climax to the first major dungeon of the game. It also sets a new bar. The bosses that you need to kill in order to open Death's Door are all people, and their characteristics are what will set them apart. And following right after, the King of the Swamp makes good on that immediate promise. Another story-driven boss, the King of the Swamp has 2 distinct phases and uses the story to justify the shift between the 2. The King of the Swamp boasts unbreakable armor that protects him from all harm, and the first phase ends when that armor shatters and you see what the King's gluttony has really turned him into. The first phase is mechanically simple to a fault. The King of the Swamp might as well just be a larger version of a mob that you've been fighting as he swings his big hammer and jumps to occasionally make some shockwaves. It fits for the story, but again, The game has decided that the character is now dictating the boss fight's mechanics instead of the mechanics dictating the story. His best attack in this phase is definitely when he starts using his mace as a pogo, which is just a funny image. A frog that can't jump on his own, so he uses a pogo stick. That's just golden. I love that. Once the armor breaks and the king falls into the water, the boss fight starts in earnest. Now this encounter is more mechanically driven than the Witch of the Urns, but also uses its mechanics very differently than the Forest Spirit and Guardian. The king spits at the crow, destroying the platform in a similar way to the mobs in the area before. Then he begins to inhale, taking away more of the floor to leave very little to stand on before he drags himself across the map to try to deal some damage. Like the witch, there's a counter here using your most recent ability, the bomb. Throw the bomb into his mouth as he inhales, and it'll cause him to stop and fall over, giving you a huge window to attack. There are more fun interactions though. His mace works like the switches in the area prior. When you hit it, whether with your arrow or a melee attack, the floor returns to the state it was in at the start of the fight. The Zelda-like concepts that began to appear with the Witch of Urns have become dialed up to 11 here. There are visual jokes within each attack, there are mechanics from the level prior that have wormed their way into the boss fight, and the magic spell you learned is the key to stopping the boss's attacks and staying in control of the battle's pace. In just 4 bosses, we've established a norm, reinforced it, completely changed that norm, and now reinforced a new normal. After this fight, there's even another funeral for the king, acknowledging that though he was a monster, everything he'd ever done was out of fear. I'd give the King of the Swamp another A grade. Though he's not quite as good as the Witch of Urns, the charm and level-driven mechanics continue to make the 3 bosses to unlock Death's Door incredibly fun climaxes. Then Betty shows up and decides not to do any of the same things that the Witch of Urns or the King of the Swamp did, and decides instead they demand a core understanding of mechanics beyond what the Spirit or Guardian required. You now need to learn and analyze the boss's moves in order to find what few opportunities you have. Betty was my personal hardest fight in the game on both playthroughs. She moves so fast and with such ferocity that if you aren't starting to dodge before the attack comes out, it's almost impossible to avoid damage. And then she speeds up as the fight progresses. Her primary threat comes from rolling across the arena and bouncing off the wall. You have to dodge to avoid the roll before it starts, then know where Betty is going to land so you can get one attack before she does it or some claw swipes. If you're ever behind her, she'll do a spinning slap that comes out almost instantly, and, at least in my experience, is not reactable. When the fight escalates, her attacks become faster and rocks begin to fall on top of that, creating more hazards and more unsafe places to stand in a very tight arena. On top of that, though Betty has a funeral like the other 2 souls you needed to find, her entire character, quote-unquote, was that she was actually a Yeti the whole time. It's a bit of an underwhelming finale, and loses that Zelda-like weakness design that the previous encounters had started building towards. It is at this point that I realized how much of a contradiction the bosses in this game were, especially with such a focused roster. Betty stuck out so severely by completely changing the core of what these bosses were going to be about. I'm not a fan of Betty as an encounter, but I can see people enjoying the precision that the fight requires. Personally though, I give it a D grade. It's alright for bosses to be but unbeatable on the first go around, but Betty comes in so far out of left field that the recurring deaths start to feel more irritating than fun. Then, the game makes what is by far the most significant 180 in boss quality the entire game. Betty took place in a simple, small arena with a fight about raw mechanics more than anything else. The Grey Crow, meanwhile, is the culmination of the entire story sequence of the game thus far, set in an atmospheric-focused arena against a character who is supposed to be somewhat of an ally that focuses on the spectacle and story of the moment. The mechanics are challenging, yes, with the crow moving at frankly ridiculous speeds, but the challenge of the mechanics here is there to enhance the spectacle and story of the crow, rather than for the challenge itself in the same way Betty was. Set in an endless white void, the crow darts and flies across the screen as a black blur, leaving these exploding chains and spawning tracking projectiles. Though he's as hard to punish as Betty is, he also has what feels like less health than Betty did. The attacks that lead to potential punish windows are also much more telegraphed than Betty's, as the Grey Crow will be moving as a blur, then charge up one massive attack that, if dodged, gives a huge opportunity to rack up damage. The Grey Crow is also the first boss in a while to not have a funeral afterwards. But whereas the Forest Spirit and Guardian didn't have funerals because they didn't have enough of a character to, the Grey Crow's boss fight feels like his own funeral. He sent you on your quest because he believed there was no fight left in him. He was a decrepit corpse who wanted to go home after all this time, but as soon as he realizes that that goal is impossible, that there is no chance of ever going home, he loses every part of who he is. And the monstrous nature of the fight pushes forward that story and characterization. If the Witch of Urns is the boss that hooked me, the Grey Crow is the boss that made me understand the boss's design. The first 5 bosses of the game aren't meant to stand independently. Each builds up different aspects of boss design and then comes together at the Grey Crow, the soul that you were really here to reap. The demonic forest spirit was a raging monster you came for but was stolen by the Grey Crow. You have to use positioning to avoid the long damage zones while still getting in punishment, just like the Crow. The Guardian of the Door kept you away from the Grey Crow and did so by raining projectiles down upon you, just like the Crow who spawns projectiles to try to keep you away. The Witch and the King were both scared of death, and each attack was built to characterize how they handled that fear. Just as the Crow goes mad from his own fear, and the madness drives his animations and tempo. And even Betty, though the increase in her speed was too sudden for her own fight, does make the animalistic thrashing of the Crow come less out of the blue. That speed sets you up for the Crow's difficulty. The bosses all acquire and focus on something different to bring them together into this incredible culmination. If you couldn't tell, I believe the Grey Crow is an easy S-grade boss. When I play these small, indie, Souls-like games, I always hope to run into a boss like this one, an encounter that brings the whole game together in such an incredible way. And the Grey Crow is one of the best fights I have fought in an indie game in a long while. And then, bringing it home, the Lord of Doors absolutely nails the final boss fight. It's the hardest fight in the game by a pretty wide margin, but uses checkpoints for the first time on top of that. Spectacle is a key component in this fight in particular, and so checkpoints stop that spectacle from ever drying out. The Lord of Doors, in terms of characterization, serves as a simple but effective villain. In terms of actions, she's done pretty horrifying things, but also gives you a cute round of applause the first time you meet her, so she's good in my book. The first phase is simple and introduces the attacks at a low pace that's not too much of a threat. This phase is very mechanically driven, using this mechanic phase in order to allow for more spectacle as you get further into the fight. Once you take down the first phase, she'll begin to travel through doors, and the entire battle changes into a chase through every corner of the world that you've discovered, reusing boss attacks and evolving as the fight continues to escalate. Between each of these phases, there's a chase section where you have to run in specific paths. The tempo on these work really well. It goes fast enough to keep you on edge, but not fast enough that you have to memorize them. As you chase her arena to arena, she gains an attack from each boss. She starts to throw bombs like the Witch, she starts to use slam attacks like the King, and she starts to use Betty's roll. And though I still don't like Betty's roll, the Lord of Doors somehow has more of a wind-up on the attack, and you already know how to dodge it. And already knowing where she's going to land so you can punish it means it never becomes a frustrating move. Thank you for teaching your moveset through some garbage trial and error, Betty. Your sacrifice may have cost your boss fight, but allowed the Lord of Doors to succeed when you failed. And after you complete the last chase section, you wind up in the main hub for the final battle. I also love the trope of the main safe hub being the final arena, and though it lacks the pure spectacle of the Grey Crow, the story significance gives the fight an awesome sense of finality. I also haven't mentioned the music throughout this entire game, and that's because it's just all really good. There's no song that ever feels obnoxious, and they all help build up their encounter really well. This final phase uses all the same attacks as earlier, adding in a couple additional full arena attacks. The Guardian's laser comes back here, and she gains the demonic forest spirit's tentacle slams, combining that with flying around the arena to create these new patterns of AoE damage. The moves still all feel unique to her, but are all familiar enough that there's no mechanical learning curve happening in this final duel. It's just a matter of executing in a spectacular, focused finale. The Lord of Doors is also an S-grade boss. Though I adore it a little less than the Crow, she is just such a satisfying finale. And with the return of the Gravedigger's final funeral, it serves as an excellent endpoint for the game. But But the game is not over yet. There is an epilogue, and it's the weakest part of the game by a pretty significant margin. You travel around collecting any of your missed upgrades, using your new spell powers to find more artifacts, health, and mana boosts, the whole works. You change the time of day, unlocking more areas that you have to search for in what were previously cleared areas to accomplish a list of goals that makes sense if you know what you're trying to do, but feel kind of random if you aren't aware of where the game is leading. One of these goals is to gather each relic, to bring them to the Gravedigger, and finally make her mortal, where her fear of death kicks in and you're finally able to put her to a long-deserved rest. According to IGN, this fight is sad. And I mean, it is a little bit sad, but I find the fact that the IGN guide to this game had to put in a special note to be sad because, well, honestly, the game just doesn't hit the same emotional high that the Grey Crow's encounter did. The Gravedigger's moveset here is inoffensive. There are a lot of area effects as she slams the ground, and the last phase in particular starts to summon hordes and hordes of minions that you have to cut through while still dealing damage to the boss. But at this point, you'll likely have collected every upgrade in the game in your pursuit of the relics. The Gravedigger is balanced at around the same level as the Grey Crow and Lord of Doors, but it's pretty easy to miss a few upgrades as you progress the main story, and the Crow and Lord are balanced around that. Hidden behind so much completion, however, the player feels over-prepared for what should be a uniquely post-game challenge, which is a rare and strange feeling, but makes the fight a little underwhelming. It's also hard to count this against the Gravedigger, but this optional boss ends up being the final boss of the entire game. After you beat it and complete the laundry list of other activities, you get a cutscene that informs you that the game, this entire time, has been a sequel to Titan Souls, which was the developer's first game, which was a bit of an underwhelming completion bonus, to put it lightly. So, with the Gravedigger being nothing more than an adequate boss, not carrying the emotional weight that IGN had warned me about, not really hiding any satisfying reward, I honestly don't think I'll ever go out of my way to fight the Gravedigger again. It is tough to grade the Gravedigger because though her place in the game makes her a disappointing final battle from a game with an otherwise incredible finale, mechanically and story-wise, she isn't bad. I think that, at the end of it, she still deserves a C grade. Though I won't ever fight her again, she wasn't a bad fight, and I enjoyed her more than I did Betty. Death's Door, overall, is a strange case of boss design. Bosses fall on all sides of the aisle in terms of design, some spectacle-driven, some mechanically driven, and some story-driven. The only other games I see able to cover this much space in terms of design are often AAA titles that are expansive, like God of War Ragnarok, and to see a game cover so much ground with such a small roster is frankly incredible, even if it does have Betty. In terms of ranking the bosses worst to best, I'd go Betty, the Gravedigger, the Demonic Forest Spirit, the Guardian of the Door, the King of the Swamp, the Witch of Urns, the Lord of Doors, and the Grey Crow. If you've played Death's Door, let me know your thoughts on its bosses below, and if you haven't, I definitely recommend giving it a play. It's pretty cheap on Steam, and even a 100% playthrough didn't take me more than like 6 hours. But that's it for me today though. Our time in this world is over. I'll see you next time. The fight decides to end with the Gravedigger to bring them to the Gravedigger's dinger. Why do I keep saying that?